Hello everyone, and welcome to the second and the final Google Hangout event for Sustainability, Society and You. So my name is Sarah Speight and I'm the course leader, and I'm joined today by some of my colleagues. We've got Isabel and Neil, who are both academics in the Department of Philosophy. We've got Mike Clifford, who's from our Faculty of Engineering. We've got Laura Graham, who's a postgraduate researcher in our School of Geography, and we've got Helen Whitehead, who's our Learning Technology Consultant. Now, before we really get underway with this Google Hangout, let's just do the health warning. This is a free technology, so we are at its mercy, and we've been having some severe interference this morning as we've just been having a run-through, so fingers crossed we don't get too much during the actual Hangout. You may find there's a time delay. You may also find that sometimes your screen freezes. If you have those issues, I would suggest you go out and come in again, refresh your screen. The recording of the Hangout, all being well, will be available to you on the step in the course sometime later on today. Let me just tell you what we're going to cover. We're going to start with Mike's Mystery Objects quiz. We're then going to move on to some of the questions that you've posted to us that we'd like to come back to, and then we'll end the Hangout with our pledges for our own individual bits of personal change. And hopefully we'll be wrapping up for about 1 o'clock, so we should last no more than an hour. Okay, so let's start with firstly Mike's Mystery Objects. Now, we had a general comment in the course from Guy Moody, and when Guy looked at Mike's 5 items, he suggested that Mike had created them all from materials that he'd found in university waste bins. Now, Mike will tell us if that's true in a couple of minutes, but before we look at the items, let me just show you my chair. I'm sitting on a nicely upholstered chair in my office that is actually a chair that Mike fished out of a university waste bin, or rather a skip, last summer, when he and I were working on the films for this course. He took it out of the skip, he brought it into Cripps' house, and then he found some fabric going spare at home. He says it's curtains. I like to think it's one of his shirts. And he reupholstered the chair for me, and it now takes pride of place in my office. So that's just a nice example. Anyway, on to his objects. Item number 1, the rather odd-looking head. We had various suggestions. Was it recycled paper, paper mache? Was it made of plastic? Was it made for a particular artistic purpose? Was it recycled magazine images? Was it recycled carpet underlay or bits of foam rubber? Andy Goodyear was nicely frivolous by suggesting, was it a Roman death mask made to frighten the kids? And was it made from recycled oil-based materials? So a range of suggestions about the head. Moving on to item 2, everyone obviously knew it was a bag, but was it a bag, thank you Helen, we'll get to the bag in a minute, that's the one. Was it crocheted from strips of plastic bags or from recycled string? Was it woven straw? Was it llama wool? Was it local fabric sewn together? And how it had been dyed. You know, was there something significant about the dyes that had created the pattern on it? And was it crocheted from bamboo? So lots of different fabrics are being mentioned. Moving on to the 3rd item, the 2 round things. We had quite a few of you who kind of chickened out of giving an answer for this one. No idea, simply cannot guess what it is. Not sure I want to know. Thank you, Mike. Those of you who did give a guess suggested, was it chocolate-covered biscuits? Was it bird food? Was it baked honey and suet? Was it fat balls for birds? Or an unsustainable chef's attempt at making meatballs that would definitely constitute food waste? Then moving on to the 4th item, a woolly hat. Was it made from recycled knit thread? Was it produced from scrap wool? So obviously everyone was just assuming it was made from wool. Was it alpaca wool from Peru? And someone reported how significant parts of their evenings are spent holding skeins of yarn from unravelled garments for his wife to rewind and then reuse. Right, so that doesn't sound much fun in your household. And then the fifth item was the bowl. Was it made from heat-treated carpet, lino? Was it plastic, laminate? Was it old carpet, paper mache? Difficult to tell scale, but could be anything from a fruit bowl to a paper tidy clip. So quite a wide range of items there. Let me now hand over to Mike, who's actually going to tell us what they are. Over to you, Mike. Okay, everyone, Mike has temporarily disappeared. So I'm sure he'll be back with us in just a moment, because I can vaguely remember what one or two of the items are, but not all of them, and I wouldn't want to get them wrong. Okay, I think he's back with us now. Yep, Mike is just reappearing. So this is the magic of live events. So I'll just wait for him to pop up again.
Hello, have I popped up? Sorry about that, the genius of Google Plus, I pressed the wrong button. I can't blame the technology, just blame my incompetence. So the first object was this item here, the mask. This is indeed an artistic attempt at making something vaguely artistic. And the material is the interesting thing here, in that it is made, I'll put it right up to the camera, of used £5 notes. So these are
I'm sorry about that. I'm sure you will have all heard some quite severe feedback there. So I think what we'll do for the moment, I'll ask Mike to type in some of his comments on the objects, and perhaps I'll come back to those a little bit later on. But let's now move on to the questions and see if we can kind of pick up on some of the other themes that we've been talking about in the course. And I'm going to start with Neil. So Neil, if we go back to, it was week 1, as in the last time we ran this course, there was a significant amount of interest in issues to do with ethics and our senses of moral obligation to act sustainably. There are a large number of comments, a great deal of interest. Now, you may not have noticed that obviously those discussions are still continuing, so I'd like to pick up on 2 of the recent postings and ask you for your response. So, we had Miriam Bolivar and Cheryl Kashuba, who were quite exercised on the topic of waste, the wasting of food and the wasting of resources. And there was a suggestion in their conversation that waste has to be the modern equivalent of the idea of sin. Okay, so that's one thread, waste and sin. And then a second discussion point was raised by Evangelia Kurumikakin. Sorry about that, everybody. So Evangelia was a bit uncomfortable with the idea of sustainability as moral obligation, and felt that actually it was more about thinking sustainability as a way of living, so turning sustainability into a moral conception rather than into a moral obligation. So there's those, if you'd like to perhaps unpick those 2 themes a bit, Neil. So the idea of waste as a form of sin, and the idea of sustainability as a moral conception rather than obligation.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think both of those questions are very interesting. Both of them seem to me to latch on to the issue of carrot versus stick, if you like. When we're wanting people to act sustainably or wanting to encourage that, should we go with positive reinforcement when they do good things, or should we go perhaps more be negative towards them when they do bad things? And I think the idea of an obligation is an idea of not just something that's good to do, but that something, when you don't do it, you're somehow at fault, or there's where you can improve. So I think partly these issues are about our psychology. What is the best way of motivating people? Is it by encouraging them, offering them rewards and praise when they do good? Or is it by being sort of negative towards them in various ways when they don't live up to those standards? So I think the idea of sin falls into the stick category. When if it's a sin, then it's something you shouldn't do, and so that's a bit of a stick. It's a negative label if we're going to say that this is a sin. Obviously the idea of sin it has religious connotations, and so one might worry that if you're not a religious believer, how much that idea can make sense to you. But I think it's important to realize that ethics and religion and these ways we label things as sin or right or wrong, these are ways of motivating people, of engaging with people. Ethics is essentially practical. It's about how people act and getting people to act in better ways. So I think, again, it's a psychological question how much people will be moved by the concept of sin, and that obviously depends in this context on their religious beliefs. Just one particular thing about the notion of sin, though, that I do worry slightly about. Certainly, I'm not a theologian, but one connotation of the idea of sin is that if you're a sinner, then you might be beyond the pale in a certain way. There's no chance of redemption. I think if sin is attached to that idea, it's problematic, because people might start to think, well, I haven't recycled today, so I'm a sinner, so why should I bother doing recycling at any point in the future? I think that's not going to be helpful in acting sustainably. We need to think about it in terms of small steps, each of which can make a change cumulatively. So that's on the issue of sin. On the issue of obligation, there were lots of interesting discussions earlier on about the notion of obligation, who defines it, what does it mean. I think obligation is more on the stick side of things. It's more of a negative thing when you don't fulfill your obligations, and again, that psychologically that might not be as encouraging to us as being positive. But I do think we want to say that there's something wrong with people who, or not wrong, but in some sense objectionable, who aren't acting sustainably, or aren't doing what they can to act sustainably once they know that they can be. And I think this notion of obligation can fulfill that role. But I also do agree that, going back to the point earlier, ethics is about our practical lives, about how we live. Acting sustainably does need to be woven into our everyday lives, and I think we'll come back later on to our pledges and how that might affect our everyday lives. So I think those very interesting questions, and fundamentally they're about this issue of whether we want to use a carrot or a stick to encourage people to behave more sustainably.
Thank you very much, Neil. We'll come back to Mike's objects in a few minutes, but I think we'll just stick with the questions for the moment. So if I can move on to Isabel, who I can see is with Neil in his office at the moment. Now, Isabel, obviously there's been quite a debate about fracking. Well, this was happening last week, and you're in conversation with Andy Goodyear and Rachel Harvey about motivation. You were saying that the really troubling question is, well, how do we motivate citizens to demand a greater share of political power and thereby share in decision making? So again, I wondered if you might like to make some comment on that, perhaps in the UK context.
Thank you, Sarah. I actually want to pick up on a point that Neil just mentioned, that I suppose a lot of these questions has to do with how we conceive of what moves people, what motivates people. And it's easy to think of carrots and sticks, and I am much more inclined to the carrots than the sticks. So I think we need to make it much easier for people to take part wherever there are already opportunities, like council meetings, local groups. So we need information about that, so people know that these things are going on and that they can have a word on them. I quite often don't know where my when my council meetings are. And I suppose I could go and find information, but it would be quite useful to just have a letter posted or something, or an email sent, something like that. So part of it has to do with awareness raising, but also connecting that awareness to personal goals and personal concerns. People want to live healthy lives, they want to live happy lives, and possibly long lives. And in order to achieve those things, they will need to coordinate with others in sustainable ways. So life is not just a matter of what happens now, but what happens down in 5 years, 10 years' time, and needing to take into account those things. So I think motivating people has a lot to do with that, with breaking something that has now become standard in politics, which is a huge distance from those who make the policies and implement those policies and those who suffer the consequences or reap the benefits. So that would be what I say. I'd go for carrots.
Well, actually, let me just go on a little bit from that then, because so you've both been talking about motivation and you voted for carrots, but there was a really interesting question that Maxine Ashton posted, again in relation to fracking. It was not something that I'd really thought about before. And she said that she believes that if fracking is to be done, then affected communities should be paid compensation. I think that was a general consensus in our opinion polls. Companies should pay compensation to affected communities. But Maxine then just said, but if companies can use the lure of compensation to get communities on side, shouldn't it therefore mean that it's wrong to pay compensation, because the compensation then can be perceived as a bribe? So the compensation might in a sense become a carrot for a behaviour that many people in this course would believe to be unsustainable. So just anything you might like just to say about that really interesting comment about compensation in fracking cases.
Indeed. I mean, the issue with compensation is a difficult issue, not just in the case of fracking, but in many other. And I think Maxine's quite right to point out that we need to be careful that our carrots are not poison chalices. I hope that's how we pronounce the word, so to speak. You know, mixing too many metaphors there. But so I think we need to be careful with that. That we are very clear about what incentives, so what kinds of behaviors we are in fact incentivizing, if I can I say that word? Incentivizing what kind of things we do want to people. And again, maybe listening a little bit more to people is important here. I'm thinking about issues to do with landfills and disposal sites. Again, informing people about how social disparities and inequalities quite often weigh more on that than perhaps more direct environmental concerns to do. You know, landfills tend to be where the poor, deprived areas of society are. You don't see them in South Kensington or next to Buckingham Palace, where, I mean, those are the... So I think you're quite right, and Maxine's quite right to say that we need to be careful that we don't turn incentives towards good behavior, if you like, into carrots to maximize greed, including personal greed, because we're all quite vulnerable to that. You know, who doesn't want more of a good thing? So we need to be careful with that, and I don't think it should be one person or a select group of people that would make that decision. Again, I think we should all have a concern to be concerned to be part of that decision. What are the right carrots?
Thank you very much for that. Okay, I now want to turn to Laura. Now, Laura, last week, which was week 5, you were having a discussion with John Payne about rewilding. Now, you both expressed scepticism about this, but I know it's a research interest of yours. And you finished one of your posts by saying that, you know, although you, generally speaking, you thought there was a lot of positives to do with rewilding, that it could also be quite problematic. So I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more to us about what you see as the whys and the why nots.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so to start with, the general idea behind rewilding is to let an area return to wilderness by giving it a bit of a helping hand, removing grazing pressure and reintroducing the top carnivores. So firstly, I'll talk a bit about the arguments for rewilding. And for me, the most important argument for rewilding is the intrinsic value of nature. And because it gives a whole ecosystem approach, rewilding would have the effect of increasing overall biodiversity and improving ecosystem function. But unfortunately, the intrinsic argument tends to be quite difficult to argue to politicians, and they're going to be who make the decisions. So to get around the debate can be set in terms of ecosystem services. And these are the benefits that we derive from nature. So I'll give a few examples of how we get ecosystem services from rewilding. The first of these is quite a hot topic this year, and that's flood protection. So increasing vegetation in both the uplands and the floodplains will reduce the impacts of flooding. Secondly, because increased vegetation will have benefits of carbon storage, reduced temperatures and storm protection, it can help us in our battle towards climate change adaptation. And then finally, again, another hot topic this year is by reducing grazing in the uplands and returning areas of grassland to wildflower meadows, we increase pollination. And pollinators are something that have come up quite frequently in the news this year as something we're worried about. But as I mentioned, I am quite sceptical about rewilding and worry about some of the problems. And the first of these, which comes up quite frequently, is the idea of our landscapes have been the way they are for hundreds of years. They're viewed as natural and they're part of our cultural heritage. And so by rewilding, we kind of lose out on that. And a good example of this is the links between the Lake District and Williams Wordsworth's work. And then in terms of economic and social sustainability, there's an issue that one of the main mechanisms in place that stops us from rewilding is the Common Agricultural Policy Subsidy Scheme. And this is hugely beneficial to farmers in the area and therefore to the social and economic sustainability of an area. So overall, I think that rewilding, the benefits would be likely to outweigh the costs, but I think it's something that will take a huge shift in policy and attitudes to achieve that. So to bring it back to the theme of the course, which is our place in global sustainability, I'd say that what we can do for rewilding is to rewild our gardens. There's plenty of advice available online on how we can make our gardens wildlife friendly. For example, creating ponds, sowing wildflower seed, and then feeding the birds. And there's also plenty of research to suggest that the cumulative effect of individual gardens efforts can be very powerful regionally. So thanks, Sarah. Those are my thoughts on rewilding.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Laura. And actually, as you were finishing off there, you touched very nicely on a question that Maureen Prendergast had posted in the STEP. Maureen said, since not everyone is willing or able to make huge changes, what are the one or two actions that would make the greatest impact? And she wanted to hear some of our views. So I'm guessing from what you've been saying, Laura, that for you, one of a very significant individual action that someone might make would be to rewild a portion of their garden. And that's something that actually I did last summer. I dug myself a small pond, which subsequently, you know, has been certainly full of frogs and snails. Okay, so thank you very much indeed for that. Now I'm going to take a risk. I don't know if I think the interference always seems to start when Mike is speaking. So let's just give it another go, and then I'm going to come back obviously to the answers to the mystery quiz that we were looking at the beginning. So we've had quite a few engineering related questions in the course. One of the most common ones that's come up in different guises is how we make the best decision about balancing old technologies and new technologies. So Ashley in week 2, in relation to the what's in your kitchen video, was saying, okay, some interesting comments about the electric kettle, but surely it's more sustainable to keep using the less efficient older model if it's still functional compared to throwing it out and purchasing a new one. Okay, so let's just see if Mike's able to answer that without interference. If he isn't, he can type me an answer, and while he's doing that, I'll go back and go through the answers to the mystery objects quiz. So, Mike, are you willing to have a go? Would you toss out your kettle if it was still functional, or would you send it to landfill and invest in a new, more energy efficiency one?
Hello, Sarah. I've
Hello.
unmuted. If it all goes wrong, then shake your head or something and I'll mute again. Kettles, interesting. I went out yesterday and I bought a new kettle. Or I bought a device that heats up 1 cup of water at a time. So a sort of, I can't remember what it was called. But the claim on the packet is that it saves 70% of electricity by just heating up the amount of water that you need for 1 cup of tea or coffee. It depends how many cups of tea you're making. If you have a kettle that you're only using once a week to make a cup of tea, then it's probably not worth the switch. But if you're making lots of cups of tea a day, then it might be more worth it. In engineering, we call this thing life cycle analysis, and someone started drilling outside my office now. So life cycle analysis, balancing up that long-term cost against the short-term gains. I'm just going to have a word with the guy drilling in the corridor. I'll be back shortly.
Right, oh gosh, that's being live for you. Right, so the interference, of course, earlier, perhaps that was caused by drilling elsewhere in the building. Right, so Mike's given us his view on that. I've got another question for him, but of course he might not quite be hearing it at the moment. So I'll read it out and then I'll just recap with him as he reappears to his desk. So Pam Macmillan, also in one of the steps, I think in week 2, wanted a kind of a similar discussion really around hot boiling water taps that new kitchens seem to now be fitted with, and also school staff rooms, so that kettles do not have to be boiled. She wanted to know if this really was an energy efficient solution for the 21st century. Now, Helen and I visited Helen's sister in London earlier this year, and your sister has these kettles, doesn't she? Sorry, these taps. So, Mike, if you can hear me, this Pam Macmillan's question, what do you think about these new hot boiling water taps that new kitchens and often school staff rooms are fitted with? Are they an energy efficient way to go?
They sound like a really good idea. I think they're particularly good for staff rooms where you're using large volumes of water. I think it's a bit like the old thing of running the taps to get a bowl of hot water for your washing up. It can take a while to bring it up to temperature with some of the designs, which is okay if you've got lots of cups of tea going through, but again, if you've just got 1 or 2 a day, then it's not going to be worth it.
Okay, so it's an issue of scale there. All right, and then I've got one more question for you, and then seeing as the sound quality seems to have sorted itself out for the moment, we'll go back to the quiz and you can give the answers yourself. So Caroline is severely exercised about sugar, and I'm going to read her comment. She says, "Fair trade sugar drives me round the twist. In the UK we grow sugar beet, which is made into sugar, silver spoon. It even has a little red tractor on the packet. And no," she says, "I do not work for them, and I do not know anyone who does. I'm all for fair trade and buy when I can all the stuff we can't grow in the UK. But come on, guys, what about locally grown foods, less food miles?" So her particular concern is, if there are products that we are growing locally, why are we still importing them, even if they are labelled as fair trade? So what would you respond to that, Dr. Clifford?
I'd say that's an interesting point, and yes, you might like to buy local sugar. I think maybe it's sort of Neil could chip in about the moral obligations to buy cash crops from overseas, particularly from nations that are former colonies, where they've been turned into large sort of plantations to grow things like tea, coffee, sugar, bananas, and that I think we should bear some of the responsibility for that and keep supporting those sort of industries. Coffee beans, for example, I think it takes 30 years for a coffee plant to mature, so it's not a case that people growing coffee can switch very quickly to growing food crops in their countries, so they're dependent on foreign cash for these cash crops. So I think there's a moral obligation to keep buying from other countries as well.
Okay, so I think it's only fair to let our philosopher give his view on that as well. So over to you, Neil.
I think Mike makes a good point. Most of the things we do, the choices we make in the modern world, have consequences not just for our country but for overseas and all around the world. If sustainability is ultimately about human welfare in the long term and the short term, and balancing those two, then I think we do need to worry if say switching to locally grown produce means that people elsewhere on the planet are deprived of their source of income, particularly if the reason they're relying on that source of income was something to do with the actions of our nations in the past. So I think Mike's right that we need to take a wider view of the costs and benefits of each path of action. And although the cost for this one, the benefit for this one would be seemingly good insofar as it's a locally grown produce. That's, it's not just people in this country that sustainability concerns. It's about justice across the whole global population as well.
Thank you both very much for that. It really does show how kind of the different levels of our decision making that we have to think through, doesn't it? Okay, at this point, we're going to go back to Mike's 5 mystery objects. Now, I think the kind of video link to Mike has gone down, so I don't think we can see him holding up the objects from his office, but we can, of course, put back the slide images that we've got. So we're going to do that, and Mike, would you like to talk us through what your 5 objects are, starting with the head?
Okay, I thought I'd cover the head. The head is made from used £5 notes. So these are end-of-life banknotes that the Bank of England needs to dispose of. Difficult to recycle them or compost them because they've got all sorts of metal and other contaminants in them. So this was a project to turn it into something that looked nice. So hence the £5 note mask or head. I don't know whether you can see me now, but I'll hold it up anyway. There you go. Number 2, I think, was the bag. So this is a bag that has been knitted from strips of shopping bags, plastic bags. It's interesting, the bag are biodegradable, so the bag is sort of falling apart a little bit, but this was knitted by the granny of one of the lecturers here who thought I might be interested in it. So quite a sweet story. I'm not sure how sustainable this is. You could use the bags for all sorts of other things like waste bin liners or so on, but you could think about using waste plastic maybe to knit yourself or crochet a bag. What's next? Oh, my brown balls. Here we go. This is one of them. I've got a slightly different shaped thing here. This is the idea about turning waste biomass into a fuel. So in lots of countries where they're cooking on wood fires, wood could be in scarce supply. So there's a need to find an alternative fuel source. And this was using agricultural residue. In this case, we used some banana skins and some sawdust and some bits of newspaper in this one as well. You get it wet, you mush it all together, squish it together, and then leave it to dry in the sun, or in this case we put it in an oven because we didn't have enough sunshine in the UK to dry it. Not suggesting you dry them in their ovens, we just needed to dry it to demonstrate proof of concept here. This is why it's gone a little bit brown. And everyone asks me if it smells of bananas, and I can exclusively reveal that it doesn't smell of anything like a banana. What next? My hat. Okay, my hat. I can put my hat on. This hat is made not from wool, it's made from yak down, from the yaks of Tajikistan. And this was a project looking at getting the yak farmers to use the down from their yaks to turn into a product. It's quite hard to separate out the down from all the nasty stuff that yaks tend to roll in when they're enjoying themselves. But we were looking at efficient separation mechanisms and then spinning the fibers into a yarn and then knitting it into a hat. So that was a project with a charity called Operation Mercy in Tajikistan. And my final mystery object was this bowl. I think someone mentioned the scale of it. It's slightly bigger than my head if you can't see the video. I've got a normal size head. This is indeed made of carpet. The carpet has been melted and then reformed using a wok, cooking wok as the mould for the bowl. And then it's made this quite nice, attractive bowl. A lot of carpet in the UK goes to landfill. It's a big problem in terms of waste. In Europe, it tends to be incinerated and they recover the heat. Problem with UK carpets is that there's a lot of wool in them, so there's less that can be heat recovered in that way or recycled and turned back into polymer. So again, you have to be aware of the different wastes, where they're coming from, and local factors can play quite a big factor into whether you can recycle something or not. And there are my 5 mystery objects.
Thank you very much, Mike. And you, I know that one of your big research areas is appropriate technologies. And I guess what you're trying to do with these pieces of work is to explore, ways in which materials can be recycled that suit the needs of particular communities and potentially generate income, but are appropriate for their context and their settings. Is that correct?
Yeah, appropriate is often used in the context of developing world, but it can be actually wherever you are, really, talking about using appropriate methods, appropriate technologies, and appropriate materials. So I did run a project a few years ago looking at recycling in Outer Hebrides, I think Shetland and Orkney. They don't have facilities to recycle cardboard at the moment, or they didn't when we did this project. So it was okay there to turn the cardboard into briquettes to burn. People were using solid wood fires, where it would be less good to do that in the mainland UK, where you'd send your cardboard and paper to be recycled.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the pledges idea. Okay, now when we got to the end, towards the end of the first run of this course back in March this year, the course team were quite inspired by, it was the Sustainable Thornbury Transition Town Initiative. And what the Sustainable Thornbury group had done was that they had decided to make individual pledges, and they had photographed, they'd captured each other actually holding up their pledges. So they'd created a formal record of that pledge, which they could then monitor and come back to. And we thought that was quite an inspiring idea. And so we decided to do it ourselves and to invite our fellow learners on this course to join in. And so we had a range of pledges that we shared back in the spring of this year. So now we've come on and we've done a second version of this course. So because our ethos is very much about collaboration, learning from each other, and actually taking small steps towards sustainability, it seems entirely appropriate for us to end by certainly some of us who made a pledge last time telling you how we've got on with it, and then offering up a new pledge for this next period of time. So I'll start, and last time round I pledged to eat less meat and to grow more veg. Eating less meat I find very, very easy, doesn't bother me at all, it's no great hardship. And for growing more veg, I've got a personal ambition to obviously make myself more sustainable in terms of food production. So this year I've grown more varieties of vegetables. So I've got my runner beans. Obviously I'm growing the standard things like onions. I'm growing garlic. I'm growing tomatoes. And for those of us in the UK, isn't it slightly alarming how early the tomatoes are this year? They're all ripening already. I've also been thinking about the sustainability of my seeds, because again I've realised with more knowledge that if you buy some seeds, they've been sterilised. They'll only produce you one crop and then they're no good. Now this is a heritage variety of purple podded pea. I purchased them last year. I kept some seeds at the end of the season, and this crop has been produced from those seeds. So I haven't had to go out and buy more seeds. So obviously that's more sustainable than buying a fresh set every year for only one crop. And then obviously I've got my my courgettes, which have turned into marrows. I've had a glut of strawberries, so this year I've also ventured into jam production. I've been thinking about my sugar, so where I get it from, how much I use. I've also been making sure I use recycled jars, so not buying any special equipment. So I think I managed my pledges, but now I need to go on to the next step. And I think that what I now need to do is I need to share my knowledge and not just my surplus. So rather than just feeding my neighbours with my surplus and glut of courgettes, I need to be supporting them instead to grow their own themselves. Okay, so that's my pledge. And in answer, Laura's just sent me a question, have I done seed swapping schemes too? I've dabbled with them, Laura, but I have a compulsion to use every seed that I possess. So I need to kind of pull back from that, control myself, and go into seed swapping instead. Okay, now I think let's pass on to Laura and see what pledge you want to.
Thank you. Okay, so I think I do fairly well in eating sustainably. I don't eat meat. I tend to plan my meals so that I don't end up with any food waste. But if I happen to be very busy, I will end up going to my Sainsbury's local, buying food that's been flown over here and comes in a lot of packaging. So my pledge is to buy more local food. I don't know if you can see that. Buy more local food and food in less packaging. That's my pledge.
Thank you very much for that, Laura, and good luck with the less packaging. That certainly was a topic of discussion back in week 2 when we were talking about rubbish or resource. Lots of people were exercised by that. Okay, let's move on to our philosophers. So we'll start with Neil, and then Neil can hand over to Isabel.
Okay, so you probably can't see because I've carefully positioned the camera so as not to display the mess that is my office, but in my office there is quite a bit of mess, and there's quite a lot of these, which are plastic bottles. This is just a water bottle. So I drink a lot of fluid through plastic bottles that then gets thrown away or recycled. But I think if you the number of plastic bottles I get through in a week is probably actually quite high. If you line them up, I'm sure it would be quite a long line. So I'm pledging this time to follow Sarah's guidance, there's Sarah, and use a reusable plastic bottle. The department has installed a water cooler in the kitchens here, so I can get plenty of water that way, and I'm going to hopefully produce fewer plastic bottles, or use fewer plastic bottles. That's my pledge this time. Shall I hand you over to Isabel? Yep, here we go, there's the transition.
I don't know if you'll be able to see my pledge, especially because it's the wrong way around for you to read, but it's to go back to basics and refuse to buy, reduce what I use, reuse what I've already got, repair whenever I can, and recycle more.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And actually, before we move away from Isabel, again, in the course, you had a conversation with a couple of other people about clothing, and I think you have a strong commitment yourself to second-hand clothing. I wonder if you'd just like to make any comment on that?
Yes, I've got a strong commitment to anything second-hand or pre-owned, pre-used. So a few years back, myself and my husband decided that we would try to get as much as possible second-hand, not just clothes but furniture. And when we say second-hand, it's important for people to remember that some things are second-hand simply because they've been bought by someone before who hasn't used them, has been having them lying around, and one happy day for me decided to dispose of them. So, but we tend to buy things in charity shops. So, for example, most, I would say, 95% of my son's toys come from charity shops or second-hand. A lot of our clothing, for all of us. I think my son's been mostly dressed all his life in second-hand clothing. And again, my commitment is because there is a lot out there with a lot of quality. It's just silly to waste.
Thank you very much for that, Isabel. I think next up we'll go to Mike. Mike, is there a pledge that you'd like to share with us?
So my pledge from last year, or last time, was this one, which was to use the photocopier less. I don't think I've been very successful, to be honest. I have tried, but it's difficult. So I have a different pledge for this time. We'll have two. The first one is to grow something edible. And I'm a long way behind Sarah with my growing season. But this is a courgette plant that I grew from seed. It's Black Beauty, apparently, if you're into your... Is that a good one? She's nodding, drinking water. Marvellous. And my other pledge is to upcycle. You've seen Sarah's chair. I've been raiding skips like they're going out of fashion the last few weeks, and my plan for the summer is to make a table with my son and some old pallets. I think I'll be sawing up my son and using the pallets to nail them back together, or the other way around, I'm not sure which. I've also made a bookcase and a vase as well out of some old pallets, so that's my pledge for the coming session.
Thank you, Mike. I don't know if you're aware that we've posted a photograph of your bookcase on our MOOC blog site. That went up last week alongside my hot composter, with just a few comments about how they were both produced. So clearly there's a lot of use for pallets out there. Okay, now last but not least, let's give our learning technologist her voice. So obviously, Helen, you've been very much involved in this course from day one. You made a pledge last time. Would you like to just review it and tell us what you're going to pledge this time?
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, last time I said that I would try to eat less meat, and I think I have succeeded in that. We were doing just one day a week without meat, but I think we're doing a lot more. It's not so difficult for me. It's a little bit more difficult for my husband. So I'm trying to sort of smuggle it past his taste buds by giving him tasty vegetable and vegetarian meals. We are still pescatarian, so we still eat fish, but I think we're doing better on that. This year, I want to do this pledge, which is to become more sustainable in my transport, or at least to find out more about it. Being as I live in an area with a lot of hills, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to do, but we shall see. I shall learn how to ride a bike again. There are free courses around here, which is great, and then see if I can use it more often. So there I am.
Thank you very much, Helen. So, as everyone will have noticed, our pledges are really quite domestic. They relate to our daily lives, they relate to what we eat, they relate to what we buy, they relate to our upcycling and recycling habits. Now, on one level, that may all seem very mundane, but of course, that is the level at which the vast majority of us, we can actually make a serious commitment to change. Several colleagues have also referred to their families. So Helen's nudging her husband along. Isabel obviously has brought up her son to believe and accept using second-hand clothing and having second-hand toys. Mike's doing all sorts of horrible things with his son. Actually, we've got a posting from Mike, haven't we, in the blog about making his son model his knitwear efforts. So anyway, several colleagues clearly are working with their families to get them involved in their own agendas. So it's that ripple effect. We all feel in this course that the small things can add up to something really quite significant. Okay, I think we're kind of coming towards the end of this Google Hangout now. There was one other question that had been posted in the step But I'm just going to throw out to my colleagues before I do the final wrap-up, because it was quite a nice question and I don't want us to overlook it. And that was from Dory Erdman. And Dory asked us, how can issues of cultural or historical preservation intersect rather than diametrically oppose ideas of sustainability? How can we preserve the past and plan for the future? Okay, so if any of my colleagues has a comment they'd like to make about that, just think it through for a moment, and I'll just kind of start us off, because I'm a historian and an archaeologist by background, so for much of my working career I've kind of lived and breathed the past and what I feel to be its significance. And on one level, for me, the big thing is engagement. It's what actually connects us to the sustainability agenda. And I think what connects me to the sustainability agenda is not just my concern with the future and the planet as it is at the moment, but it's my concern with losing what we have built over the continuum of human history. And I think that gives us a very strong emotional connection. We saw it earlier in, I think it was probably week 1, I think, when we were discussing landscapes and what landscapes meant to us. I think that connection with the past, if we've got respect for it, if we understand its relevance in terms of the stories it tells us about how societies have interacted with their environments, that's incredibly important. It is also, of course, an invaluable recreational resource, our cultural heritage. And again, it gets us out there into the great outdoors. There's an idea, or there's an academic notion of moral education, and the idea of the citizens outdoors. These are concepts from cultural geography. These are things that, again, enable us to care more about our environment. So our environment is a resource for learning, for respect, and for relevance. And so for me, these are all really important reasons why our cultural and historical legacy is absolutely crucial to sustainability. Okay, Neil is nodding sagely, so I'll just hand over to him and see if there's anything.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, I think the point you raise is one issue that is sometimes phrased in terms of the distinction between weak sustainability and strong sustainability. So sometimes sustainability is discussed in terms of a fair savings rate, or saving economic capital for future generations. I think the point you raise is that we need to think not just about economic capital, but cultural capital and social capital. We have progressed as a civilization. We have historical places that are unique and have a unique sense of place. We don't want to sacrifice those for some economic benefit, which might be more fungible, might be more variable, but will be less unique. I think another issue that relates to is the issue we were talking about earlier on about motivation. If you can embed the sustainability in a kind of cultural and a social context, I think people might be more motivated to pursue it. I remember from the first running of this course, there was someone who, some parable, I think in a religious text, along the lines of, when I grew up, there were crops there and trees there that my grandfather had planted, and so I'm going to plant new trees so that my grandchildren can do the same thing. Now that's part of a cultural, social narrative that I think motivates that sustainability. It's not, you won't see the benefit yourself of planting those things for your grandchildren, but you can see it as part of a cultural narrative, and I think that can have a great motivating effect. So it speaks to the question of motivation that we were talking about earlier on.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Neil. I think that's a kind of fitting last word in the course. So let me just conclude by firstly saying I'm sorry about the interference that we had earlier on in the Hangout, but we did seem to get over that. So hopefully that didn't spoil your enjoyment too much. We have picked up on a range of questions that were unanswered in the various steps in the course. The course is not over yet. We've got several days still to run, so obviously the team will still be going back in and responding and interacting with yourselves and others. And it's worth noting that obviously one of the sustainable strengths of these courses is that when we officially finish, we're not finished, are we? Because everyone who's registered can continue using the course, accessing the resources, posting comments, joining in discussions, and indeed they still are from version 1, which finished officially back in March. And there is no pressure on anyone to complete this course at a particular rate. So there are lots of people still working through different steps. So I hope you all got something worthwhile out of the Google Hangout. We quite enjoy doing these, although they are quite stressful, because you never know when something's going to go wrong, but we always try and have a bit of a plan B. So I would just like to thank my colleagues very much for joining in today. So we've had Laura from the School of Geography, we've got Mike from Engineering, we've had Isabel and Neil from the Department of Philosophy, and then of course Helen from our Learning Technology team. So that's it. Bye for now. The recording will be available in a few hours' time. Do continue posting, joining in the discussions, and we'll see you all back in the course. Bye everyone.